Hello and welcome to another revision talk through from me, the history tutor. In this video we're looking at the Germany topic 1890 to 1945 for AQA, and we're going to be looking at the development of the Weimar Republic and the problems it faced in the years 1918 to 1924. So this video is going to give you all the key knowledge about the Weimar government 1918-1924, and in particular focusing on the problems it faced with rebellions, its constitutional weaknesses, and of course the problems of 1923, the year of crisis, where we get the Ruhr events and we get the hyperinflation. So do watch this a few times, see if you can solidify your knowledge, and then come back to my tutoring channel or my revision guides to practice an exam question in detail. So I'll talk you through and tutor you on how to answer a question correctly so that you can go into your exams with confidence and the correct technique to be successful. Now, let's go to the key content. Okay, so I'm going to look at these events in reasonably chronological order, and we're going to start with our first problem with rebellions, which we'll come back to later on. So the first rebellion of significance the Weimar government, the new government, faced was in January 1919. The Spartakists, the communists, tried to seize power in Berlin, and they were pretty successful with seizing control of much of Berlin, and in fact the Weimar government of Ebert fled away and they went to a town called Weimar, which is actually why they're called the Weimar government. But the army and the Freikorps, the free soldiers who had come back from the front line, crushed the rebellion, and the Spartacist leaders Luxemburg and Liebknecht were executed. So the threat initially of a communist revolution inspired by the Russian Revolution was gone for now. So the second problem the Weimar government faces is the Treaty of Versailles. Now, before I go any further, if you want to know more about this, then do look at my 1918 to 1939 conflict and tension videos about the Treaty of Versailles, which tells you the international perspective and gives you a little bit more detail on it if you think you need to know more about this big event. The Germans were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles terms. The Socialist Chancellor Scheidemann resigned after signing it, calling it a diktat of a treaty. Now, this leads obviously to a problem where the socialists are again blamed for the problems of the war, and we'll come back to this idea of the stab in the back later on. So what were the terms of the Treaty of Versailles? There is a little sort of teacher tool, LAM, which helps you remember some of the key things about it. However, obviously other words can be used. L is for land, but you could also refer to it as territory. They lost around 15% of their land. 6 million Germans were now living in other countries. Some of the famous land loss was the Alsace-Lorraine to France, the Polish corridor that split Germany into two, as you can see there, where it's got sort of West Prussia labelled in a little map there. That land goes to Poland, and all foreign colonies were lost. The army was reduced to 100,000 soldiers, and they were not allowed to conscript soldiers for forced military service, and they had no tanks. However, the restrictions weren't just the army, they were the military in general, so there was no air force, the navy was only allowed 6 battleships, and there was no U-boats allowed, only allowed 15,000 sailors. Money is the next one on the LAM list, but you might also want to make sure you remember the word reparations or financial impacts, and there was 6.6 billion to be paid in terms of reparations. That was from 1921. Blame obviously is a big part of this. The fact that they were blamed for the war, despite other countries causing it as well, meant that Germany had to accept the reparations and the military restrictions and all the other punishments. So the blame is one of the most hated aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. As I mentioned earlier, the stab in the back myth is an important aspect about the birth of Weimar. The Weimar government born out of signing the peace, and also they signed the Treaty of Versailles. So the nationalists started to believe that communists and socialists had stabbed Germany in the back. This is called the Dolchstoß. They believed that socialists were the November criminals. So back in November 1918, they had ended the Kaiser, they had signed the armistice, they then in 1919 signed the Treaty of Versailles. These nationalists believed Germany was winning the war, and after all, they're fighting in France on French territory. They had defeated Russia. Potentially, they still could have won the war. Earlier in 1918, in the late summer, they were 40 kilometres from Paris, so they believed they were potentially going to win. The problem number 4 is the Weimar Constitution itself. So the Weimar system is a democratic system set up in the town of Weimar, as I said earlier. So when the Spartacist revolt took place, the government fled to Weimar to set up this new constitution. So what was the constitution? Everyone in Germany aged over 21 could vote, men and women. The votes were split proportionally in the Reichstag to give each party their seats. For example, if you gained 10% of the vote, you gain 10% of the seats in the Reichstag. This is called proportional representation. The president was elected every 7 years, and he would choose the chancellor, the prime minister. To be aware that this is not the same electoral time as the Reichstag. That would be elected every 4 years, or whenever an election was called if the Reichstag wasn't setting up a good government. The president, though, could also use something called Article 48 and use emergency dictatorial powers to push through laws if there was a crisis or if the Reichstag was failing in some way. This is a crucial aspect of the Weimar Constitution. Being aware of the political spectrum. So we often talk about left-wing ideas, right-wing ideas, centre ideas, liberal ideas, making sure you know what the different political parties are and what they represent. So I'm going to start on the extreme left and work my way around to extreme right. So firstly we have the Spartakists. These are the communists. They wanted a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship. They wanted all the wealth shared equally amongst everyone. They wanted everything in the country owned by the country. This is called being nationalised, and everyone has a fair share in everything. Obviously the rich and the right wing are not going to be happy to have a fair share and give up everything. The socialists are more democratic. They wanted wealth shared, higher taxes for the rich, better help for the poor. The Socialist Party were the biggest party in Germany. The Zentrum or centre liberal parties were middle class parties. They wanted things to mostly stay the same. They wanted to benefit the middle class to keep growing and creating wealth. They did also want to help poorer people. The German Democratic Party, the DDP, this was a slightly more conservative party, so slightly right of centre. They were again middle class and wealthy people. They had quite liberal policies, but more towards helping the rich. The Catholic Party would have had a lot of Catholic votes, particularly in the southern states of Germany. They wanted to keep traditional Catholic values. They were quite right-wing because they wanted to maintain old traditional ideas. So we'd see that as quite a right-wing idea, right-centre idea. Then the People's Party is a moderately nationalist party. They were conservative. They wanted to support rich people and industrialists. Obviously, they were more anti-left-wing. We then get the slightly more extreme National People's Party. This was much more towards a nationalist idea. They were supported again by conservatives, ex-soldiers, wealthy business people, were very anti-socialist. And finally we got the extreme right, which is the Nazi Party. They were very nationalist, they were racist, they were dictatorial beliefs, wanted empire, war, etc. They were led by Hitler. Now you might notice here there's more right-wing parties than left-wing. If we consider the DDP slightly right of centre, we've got the Catholic Party, the DVP, the DNVP, and then the Nazis. It's a lot more right-wing parties. That means that for the socialists, the biggest party, making a coalition government was very difficult, as I'll talk about now. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution? So one of the most democratic countries in the world has been created out of the Weimar Constitution. There's freedom of speech, liberty for people. People could make voting choices for themselves. However, one of the big weaknesses, there was a lack of stable government. So remember, the socialists were the biggest party. They would gain about 30 to 40% of the vote. So they couldn't form a full majority government. They needed to work with one of the nationalist parties or the centre parties. That meant a lot of arguing and discussion to try and make an agreement between them that's going to form a government. So they're easily under crisis. These governments fell apart and collapsed, and then new elections were required. So in the years 1918 to 1924, there was not a single government that lasted the full 4 years. The SDPs, obviously, as I said, struggled to make coalitions with right-wing parties, and there were too many freedoms almost. People started to rebel, have risings, had extreme parties. So Germany had just been a dictatorship, but now it had all this freedom, and almost the people didn't know how to manage it. Okay, next back to problem number 1, rebellions. So we've got the Kapp Putsch is the second big rebellion. This was 1920. So the Kapp Putsch was caused by a government attempting to cut the army to 100,000 soldiers. Remember, they had to cut down their army, so that means sacking soldiers. It also means rounding up the Freikorps and stopping them being their sort of voluntary soldiers, as it were. Kapp, an officer, refused to demobilise his soldiers, and he seized control of Berlin. The army and the Freikorps did nothing about this. They were unwilling to attack their own people. So seemingly there was nobody to stop this rising. But then a workers' general strike crippled the city, and the Freikorps had to give up, and the Kapp Putsch was over. Inspired by this, we then get a very short-lived and small idea called the Ruhr Red Rising. So following on from the general strike in Berlin, a 50,000 strong Red Army developed in the Ruhr and seized power. But once the Kapp Putsch was ended by the army, the Freikorps then came and crushed the Ruhr Red Army. So that little communist revolution was over. Then Problem number 5, the big one, the Ruhr Crisis and hyperinflation. So what's the cause of all this? So by 1923, Germany fell behind with reparations payments. It started paying them in 1921 and it managed to pay the 1921 to 22 payment, but it didn't manage to do the 1922 into 1923 payment. So the French and Belgians occupied the Ruhr, which was a big industrial area of Germany, and they were going to force the sale of goods and taking of goods from the factories to sell to pay reparations. The Germans refused to help the French. This was called passive resistance. They didn't want to load the trains or only work for them. Passive resistance became very popular in Germany, so the nationalist government printed money to pay the strikers and support it. So next the crisis develops as printing money was needed to pay the strikers. The government has a weak background here, though, for printing money, which means that hyperinflation develops. It's worth remembering a number of factors are weakening the German economy. So firstly, they expect to pay reparations. Secondly, they have a huge debt from the First World War. And thirdly, they are a socialist government on the whole, and they have expensive workers' policies like pensions and health insurance and trying to improve working conditions. All these things cost money. They also have other things to consider, like huge debts from war pensions. And of course, not producing things in the Ruhr means they're not exporting things around the world. So obviously they're losing tax income as well as a nation. So this weak background leads to inflation developing rapidly. So February 1923, the dollar is worth 7,000 marks. By July 1923, $1 is worth 160,000 marks. And then November 1923, $1 is worth 130,000 million marks. So clearly the currency is losing value very rapidly and it's pretty much worthless by the late summer. So there were people affected in different ways during this time. There were some winners and losers. So the winners were people with loans and mortgages, and they could pay their debts easily. Property owners, people who had lots of land and property, were maybe resistant to hyperinflation, as lots of their assets were not going to be affected by paper money. And people who were weekly workers whose wages went up with inflation rapidly were generally okay, but obviously still had a stressful life trying to spend their money before it became worthless. Losers, middle class people generally on salaries that were yearly wage earners. Also pensioners. Pensions did not go up quickly enough with inflation. People with savings obviously lost all their savings. Banks lost out as loans lost value and things were paid back easily. So there were many people who lost out here. Now, we might find the middle class are the worst affected, as you can see there. They might be therefore turning towards more Nazi and nationalist ideas if a crisis comes along in the future. So how are the problems solved? So now we need to turn to Gustav Stresemann, and we'll talk about him now a little bit also in the next video, 924 to 28. So Stresemann becomes Chancellor. In September 1923, he promised to pay reparations. The French agreed to leave the Ruhr, and to afford to pay reparations, he had to sack 700,000 public officials and civil servants. He has managed to get the French to leave the Ruhr, but it's very unpopular paying back reparations and sacking people. So November 1923, hyperinflation came to an end when he introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark, and all the old marks became worthless. So clearly, lots of people have lost out and maybe expected to get money back. Again, those middle class people with savings lost out massively. So opposition to Stresemann then develops. Clearly, these policies are unpopular with the nationalists. The Nazis responded to Stresemann repaying reparations by leading the failed Beerhall Putsch in November 1923, tried to overthrow the government. And this was supported by many right-wing groups in the area. So to find out more about that, do look at my early Nazis video from 1918 to 1928. And it's got a detailed account of that Beerhall Putsch. Well, if you find this useful, then do have a look at my revision guides. There's a whole range of revision guides for AQA, and hopefully I've got lots of your topics you're studying, a lot full of talk-through videos, keynotes, and tutoring videos, importantly, on how to answer questions to a top grade. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful. Do look through it a few times to maybe check your knowledge and check your understanding. Then do, as I said earlier, have a look on my exam questions or take a look at my revision guide for more advice on how to produce a top grade answer. Right, if you find these useful, do subscribe and I shall see you again soon. Bye bye for now.